The moment someone discovers their own strength usually comes from pain. In my case, it hit me on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. There I was, standing at the altar of St. Patrick's Cathedral, surrounded by 500 high society guests from Manhattan. White flowers adorned every inch of the place, while light streaming through the stained glass windows created a colorful show down the central aisle. The musicians started playing the wedding march, and then Ashley appeared at the entrance, absolutely stunning in her Vera Wang dress. Her smile lit up the entire room, but there was something in her eyes that made me uneasy. Victoria, her mom, was right behind her with that superior look that always bothered me. In that instant, I got a chill down my spine. Something told me this wasn't going to be just another upscale New York wedding. Subscribe to the channel and hit like for more stories like this. Victoria came up to me before Ashley got to the altar. In a commanding whisper, she demanded that I switch sides for the official wedding photo. According to her, the right side belonged to the more traditional family, which in this case was theirs. I politely ignored her, staying exactly where I was. After all, I'd already given in to all her whims during all the wedding planning. Victoria's face twisted in disgust. She turned to Ashley, who was already standing next to me, and started making subtle gestures. I caught a glimpse out of the corner of my eye when Ashley furrowed her brow, clearly irritated. The priest was still talking about unity and respect, but I just couldn't concentrate anymore. "Michael, my mom's right. You need to switch sides," Ashley whispered, gripping my arm tightly. I stayed firm, murmuring that it was just ridiculous. The guests started noticing something was off. A buzz began to spread through the church pews. Then everything fell apart. Ashley turned to me, her face flushed with anger. "You've always been like this, stubborn and arrogant," her voice echoed through the cathedral. Before I could reply, I felt her hand smash against my face. The sound of that slap resonated through the entire place. The ensuing silence was deafening. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on me, some shocked, others pitying, and some with a weird, morbid pleasure at the scandal. William, Ashley's dad, covered his face with his hands, clearly embarrassed. Brandon, my best friend, was already on his feet, ready to step in. I straightened my tie, stared right at Ashley and Victoria, and without saying a word, turned on my heel and walked toward the exit. As I walked out of the cathedral doors, flashes started popping off everywhere. Some guests had already shared the incident on social media, and the local press was on standby. I kept my dignity, got into the car, and told the driver to take me home. During the ride, my phone just wouldn't stop buzzing. Ashley's messages begging me to come back mixed with notifications of news reports being published in real time. Groom ditches millionaire wedding after bride slap. The sensational headlines kept piling up. At home, I locked the door and switched off my phone. Brandon showed up an hour later with a bottle of whiskey and the first details about the chaos that erupted after I left. Victoria was trying to control the damage, claiming that I'd provoked the situation. Meanwhile, some guests had already shared videos showing exactly how everything went down. "Dude, you won't believe this," Brandon said, showing me his phone. "The slap video already has over 1 million views. People are on your side." I watched the online reactions with a mix of relief and sadness. Comments were calling out Ashley and Victoria's behavior and questioning the values of the traditional Richmond family. William, Ashley's dad, called me from his personal number. I answered out of respect for the man who'd always treated me well. "Michael, son, I'm really sorry for all this. I tried to raise Ashley with values different from Victoria's, but I failed." His voice carried deep disappointment. The next few days were a whirlwind. Reporters camped outside my apartment, while Ashley kept trying to get in touch through different numbers. Victoria gave a disastrous interview trying to defame me, but it backfired when several guests began exposing her history of controlling behavior. I decided I needed to get away. I packed some clothes, grabbed important documents, and checked into a low-profile hotel on the outskirts of the city. Brandon was my only tie to the outside world, keeping me updated on events as I tried to process everything that had happened. The public humiliation had turned into an avalanche of exposure nobody could have predicted. After 2 weeks at the hotel, I got a message from an unknown number. It was the owner of Le Bernardin, one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, inviting me to a special dinner. Something felt off. Brandon looked into it and discovered that Victoria had booked the whole place for that night. They planned it all out, Brandon explained. They even got a New York Times team in position to cover a supposed reconciliation. The manipulation was obvious. Ashley and Victoria were trying to use the media to pressure me publicly, hoping I wouldn't make a scene in such an upscale venue. I decided to show up, but on my own terms. I arrived early and talked with Eric Reipert, the chef owner, and explained the situation. He, having dealt with high society power plays himself, agreed to help me out. When Ashley and Victoria arrived, flanked by photographers strategically positioned, I was already seated at a central table. Victoria smiled for the cameras, trying to project the image of a reconciled family. Ashley looked uncomfortable, but stuck to her mom's script. "Michael, dear, I'm so glad you came." Victoria began her act. But before she could continue, I raised my hand for silence. The photographers closed in, eager to capture the moment. "You all orchestrated this circus thinking you could corner me," I said calmly. "But this time I control the narrative." I signaled, and Eric appeared with his team carrying champagne flutes for everyone, even the photographers and other patrons who, actually, were my strategically placed friends. "A toast to the truth," I announced, raising my glass, "and to the freedom to choose not to be manipulated." The flashes went off as Victoria's composure unraveled, realizing that her plan was backfiring. Ashley tried to say something, but I was already standing. "The photos you wanted have already been taken, just not the way you imagined." I left the restaurant, leaving mother and daughter in shock, while the photographers recorded their expressions of defeat. The next morning, the truth was on every single newspaper. Groom turned social trap into a lesson in dignity. The Richmond family didn't take the public humiliation well. Victoria hired one of the most expensive law firms in the city, claiming defamation and emotional damages. The irony was thick. They were suing me for exposing what they themselves had done. The lawsuit landed on my doorstep one Thursday morning. Brandon, who's also a lawyer, looked over the documents and laughed. "They have no idea what they've done," he said, sorting through several files. "Now we've got legal grounds to expose everything." While preparing the defense, we discovered a series of irregularities in the Richmond family's business dealings. Victoria had manipulated corporate contracts and used the wedding as a way to access privileged information about my family's companies. The email exchanges between her and Ashley revealed a meticulously planned strategy. On the first day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Victoria entered with her usual air of superiority, sporting an impeccable Chanel and subtle jewelry, trying to portray herself as a concerned mother. Ashley sat by her side, thinner and more dejected than usual. "Your Honor," their lawyer began, "my client suffered irreparable harm to her reputation after the defendant turned a private moment into a media spectacle. He presented selected headlines and witness testimonies from carefully chosen guests. When it was our turn, Brandon calmly stood up. "Your Honor, we'd like to present some evidence." The courtroom screen lit up with the full, unedited video of the wedding. The body language of Victoria, her whispered demands, Ashley's manipulation. Everything was there in high definition. But the knockout blow came next. Brandon played an audio recording of a meeting between Victoria and her lawyers, where she admitted planning to use the wedding to access confidential info. "I need idiot Michael to get his family's contracts," her voice said, clear as day. The courtroom fell silent. Ashley stared at her mother in horror, as if hearing it for the first time. William, sitting in the front row, stood up and left the room without looking back. "Furthermore," Brandon continued, "we're submitting evidence of tax fraud and corporate manipulation." He handed a folder over to the judge. "The Richmond family isn't suing my client for defamation. They're trying to silence the truth." Victoria stood abruptly, her face red with fury. She tried to argue that the audio was doctored, but even her legal team looked uncomfortable. The judge observed everything with growing interest. After 3 hours of hearing, the verdict was in. Not only was the lawsuit thrown out, but the judge also ordered that all the evidence be turned over to the public prosecutor for a criminal investigation. When I left the courtroom, I found Ashley crying on a bench. She tried to approach me, but her own attorneys held her back, fearing any contact could worsen the legal situation for the family. Victoria disappeared out back, avoiding the reporters that had already gathered at the main entrance. The truth that came out that day was just the beginning of the end for the Richmond Empire. And, ironically, it all started with a slap that was meant to humiliate me, but ended up revealing who really deserved to be exposed. The scandal in court sent shockwaves through the Richmond family. Ashley, finally realizing the extent of her mother's manipulations, decided to do something no one expected. She arranged an exclusive interview with CNN without consulting Victoria or their lawyers. I watched the broadcast from my apartment with Brandon by my side. Ashley appeared without makeup, dressed simply, a completely different image from the socialite everyone knew. Her voice trembled as she began to speak. "I grew up believing that social status and appearances were everything," she began. "My mom controlled every aspect of my life, from who I could talk to what clothes I was supposed to wear. Marrying Michael was no exception." The interviewer asked about the slap in the aisle. Ashley began to cry. That moment, it was the climax of years of manipulation. My mother whispered that if I didn't defend our position, she'd cut me off. I was so conditioned to obey her that I attacked the man I loved without thinking. Then she revealed something I didn't even know. Victoria had planned the wedding not just for my family's contracts, but also because she found out that Ashley planned to move to Europe and start a life away from her control. "I found documents in her office," Ashley continued, "spreadsheets detailing how she would use the wedding to absorb Michael's family companies. There was even a plan to force me to ask for a divorce once she got what she wanted." When the interviewer asked about William, her father, Ashley sighed deeply. "My dad was always against my mother's methods, but she constantly blackmailed him with divorce and scandal. Eventually, he became a shadow of the strong man he once was." Then, live on air, Ashley did something extraordinary. She looked right into the camera and said, "Michael, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm breaking free. I'm giving up everything, my inheritance, my name, my social status. I don't want to be part of this manipulative world anymore." Victoria tried calling the network to cut the transmission, but it was too late. Ashley went on to expose decades of manipulations, lies, and schemes within Manhattan's high society. Names were mentioned, shady deals were revealed, and arranged marriages were exposed. When the interview ended, my phone rang. It was William. "She finally broke free," he said, his voice choking up. "I just signed the divorce papers. 25 years of submission are over." That night, the Richmonds became the hottest topic in New York. Victoria locked herself in her penthouse while old friends and social allies began publicly distancing themselves. The empire she'd built on appearances and manipulation was crumbling. Ashley left the city that very night, without saying where she was headed. I later heard that she had donated most of her jewels and designer clothes to charity. Her last message to me was short. "Thanks for showing me that there's strength in the truth. I hope one day you find someone who truly deserves your love." Ashley's interview wasn't just a confession. It was a declaration of independence that inspired others to question the invisible chains of society that kept them trapped. The Richmond downfall came faster and harsher than anyone could have predicted. The investigation sparked by Ashley's revelations uncovered decades-long schemes of tax fraud and money laundering. Victoria, who once ruled New York society, now faced criminal charges. Sitting in my office, I watched through the window as photographers still tried to catch the moment the police arrived at the Richmond mansion with search warrants. Brandon came in carrying a folder of documents and a worried look. "I just got out of a meeting with the investigators," he said. "Victoria tried to funnel millions into offshore accounts when she realized she'd be investigated. The authorities blocked everything. The Richmond fortune is basically frozen." The news kept coming. The country club canceled the family's lifetime membership. Charities removed the name Richmond from their donor lists. Former friends of Victoria started giving interviews, revealing even more sordid secrets. William reached out to me for coffee. I met a transformed man. no longer in his immaculate suit, dressed casually, and with a genuine smile I'd never seen before. "I sold the Southampton house," he said. "For the first time in decades, I made a decision without running it by Victoria." He showed me a photo of Ashley he had received. She was somewhere in Tuscany, working at a small cafe. "She's happy," said William. "She said that for the first time in her life she doesn't have to pretend to be someone she isn't." Victoria made one last desperate attempt to save her reputation. She held a press conference at the Four Seasons, but only a few gossip blogs showed up. Her rehearsed speech about being a victim of a conspiracy sounded empty. New York's social queen had lost her crown. Lawsuits piled up. Former employees revealed compromising documents. Business partners broke contracts. The real estate empire started to crumble. The mansion on Park Avenue was the first to go up for auction. "She's completely isolated," Brandon told me. "Even her 15-year-long driver quit. The last people she had contact with were those she blackmailed, and now that even her evidence has been seized by the police, she doesn't have that anymore." One afternoon, I got a letter from Ashley, mailed from Italy. "True freedom," it read, "lies in accepting who we really are. I learned that the hard way, but at last I'm at peace." William decided to move to the countryside, far away from the Manhattan spotlight. "I'm going to open a little bookstore," he told me during our last meeting. "You know that dream we gave up because of social pressure? I'm finally reclaiming mine." Victoria, in the end, was seen leaving her last apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in the Upper East Side, with just 2 Hermes suitcases. Rumor had it she moved to a spa in Switzerland, fleeing the lawsuits and public humiliation. The Richmond empire, built on facades and lies, was gone. The grand parties, charity events, and social column photos all turned to dust. And oddly enough, the people who once thrived in that world seemed noticeably lighter, as if they'd been freed from a spell. In the last week of autumn, Ashley made one final move. She quietly returned to New York and asked to meet me in Central Park. Brandon insisted on coming along, keeping his distance as I walked over to the bench where she sat. The Ashley I met was different. Her hair, once perfectly dyed blonde, now showed its natural brown color. Her nails weren't painted, and she was wearing jeans and a simple sweater. Her eyes, usually all dolled up for social events, held a calm I'd never seen before. "I needed to see you one last time," she began. "Not to ask for forgiveness. I know some things can't be fixed, but to thank you." Her words took me by surprise. "Your refusal to bow to my mom's demands that day showed me something I'd never realized, that we can choose our own path." She told me about her new life in Italy, how she wakes up early to help open the cafe, how she learned to make homemade pasta from an elderly neighbor, how she discovered the joy in simple things she once considered beneath her. "Last week, a customer spilled coffee on my apron," she laughed. "A few months ago, I'd have made a big fuss. Now, I just cleaned it up and kept on working. It's freeing not to be a slave to appearances anymore." We sat in silence for a moment, watching leaves fall from the trees. "I heard my mom is in Switzerland," she commented. "Still trying to keep up appearances even after losing everything. She'll never change, but I don't need to be part of that story anymore." Ashley pulled out a small package from her bag. "I found this among my things." It was a photo of us from years ago before her mom turned our relationship into a corporate merger project. In the photo, we were smiling genuinely. No poses, no pretense. "I want you to have it. A reminder that there was a time when things were real." "What are you going to do now?" I asked, tucking the picture into my pocket. "I bought a little house on the Tuscan coast," she replied. "I'm going to open my own cafe. Small, simple, but mine. My dad's coming to visit next month. The first time we'll meet without my mom looming over us." When she got up to leave, I noticed that she no longer carried the artificial air that Victoria had imposed on her. Her movements were natural, relaxed. "I guess sometimes you have to lose everything to find who you really are," she said. "Goodbye, Michael. I hope you find someone who loves you for the amazing person you are, not for what you represent socially." She started walking away, then stopped and turned back one last time. "And thanks for not giving in that day. Your courage changed more lives than you know." I watched Ashley disappear among the park trees. Brandon came over, putting his hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" I took a deep breath, feeling the crisp autumn air. "I am, and for the first time I think she is too." That meeting marked the true end of a story that started with a slap, but ended with a lesson about authenticity and courage. Winter arrived in New York, bringing with it a sense of new beginnings. I finally felt ready to make some major changes in my life. I sold my Manhattan apartment and started planning a stint in Europe. Brandon helped me wrap up the last legal loose ends. All the lawsuits involving the Richmonds were closed, and Victoria was ordered to pay a $1 million fine, along with facing potential jail time. The latest news even said she'd lost her safe haven in Switzerland when local authorities uncovered irregularities in her documents. William reached out before I left. His little bookstore in the countryside was thriving, and he looked rejuvenated. "You know, Michael, I spent years living the life Victoria dictated. Now, for the first time, I'm living my own story." I received a postcard from Ashley. Her cafe in Tuscany had become a popular local hangout. She'd found her place in the world, far from the suffocating social pressures. The photo showed a smiling woman with flour on her face, teaching kids how to bake cookies. On the eve of my departure, I made one last visit to the place where I'd been married. St. Patrick's Cathedral still stood majestic, but now it symbolized something different to me. Not humiliation, but liberation. "Ready?" asked Brandon, who would drive me to the airport the next morning. "More than ever," I replied, looking out at the city that had witnessed so much change. In my suitcase, along with clothes and documents, I carried the photo Ashley gave me in the park. Not as a reminder of lost love, but as a symbol that sometimes you need to lose something to gain your freedom. London would be my first stop, then Paris, and after that, well, I'd let fate decide. For the first time in a long time, I didn't have a set plan, and that was exactly what I needed. Subscribe to the channel and hit like for more stories like this. 6 months have passed since I left New York. My trip around Europe turned into a journey of self-discovery. In London, I learned to appreciate solitude. In Paris, I rediscovered the joy of the little things. In Amsterdam, I made friends without ever worrying about social status. The New York news felt more and more distant. The Richmond Empire became nothing more than a footnote in the city's history. Victoria was finally convicted, though she managed to cut a deal for house arrest. William turned his bookstore into a cultural hub, hosting reader meetups and poetry sessions. I got an email from Brandon telling me that Ashley had married an Italian baker. A simple ceremony with no show-offs, just people who really mattered. It looked like she finally found the happiness she'd been searching for. I decided to settle in Barcelona. I bought a small apartment with a view of the Mediterranean and started working as an independent consultant. For once, my value wasn't measured by my last name or bank balance, but by what I could truly offer. The slap I got at the altar, which should have been my moment of ultimate humiliation, ended up being my liberation. Sometimes I think about how one single moment can completely change the course of so many lives. Yesterday, as I walked along the beach watching the sunset, I realized that I was finally at peace. There was no more anger, no more hurt, no more regrets. Just gratitude for having the courage to say no to manipulation and yes to my own truth. The future, it's wide open, exactly as it should be. Subscribe to the channel and hit like for more stories like this.